part 3 of the Future of HGV debates. In the first 2 sections, we've looked at what are the options, how they go forward, what we do about it, what technologies are working, etc. And in this one, we're going to look at, whether the market will be able to develop and deploy the equipment and infrastructure together with the financing of this, for the company's preferred options. So, and then we're going to look at a couple other things. As the green transition works, does market forces make it happen, or do we need the government to do it? And then if there is government legislation, how can we influence them to do the right things? Because we know as logisticians that, if the government get involved, we want them to get involved in the correct way that help and don't hinder, deliveries, effectiveness, cost to serve, and the green agenda, which we're all behind here. So, so if we make a selection, do you think market forces can make it happen, or do we need the government to be really instructing us and telling us what to do in a nice way to deploy an option? Let's say it was either hydrogen or EVs. Do you think it can happen by itself, or do we need the government to legislate and maybe send some tax incentives, etc., to make it happen quickly?
Well, I'll jump in first down on this one, if I may. I think absolutely the government needs to help get this started. And as I said at the beginning of this podcast, the project I'm running in at the moment is government funded to try and catalyse EHGVs onto the marketplace and try and help take the sting out of some of the upfront costs to try and get these things moving. And what we've discovered now, having gone through a little bit, is that the trucks that we've got ordered and are delivered so far is in excess of 140 trucks on our project, and that in the entirety of the UK, that constitutes 25% of all EHGVs on the UK roads. So on the one hand, that's a really, really promising thing that we've been able to contribute really effectively to and put a large slice of the total pie on the roads as a result of government incentives and backing to give people the justification to get going. However, when you look at that number versus all HGVs on the road, it's 0.2%. So on the one hand, we're doing, a huge amount of traction, pun intended, to get things going. But on the other hand, we're still a very small percentage of the total. And that's not going to change unless the government continually support to get these things started, because I don't think market forces on their own is going to do it. It's not even doing it now in cars, right? The ZEV mandate is driving the manufacturers to produce a certain percentage of EVs every year, and that's enforced upon them, and it's making the change happen. If it wasn't for that regulation, they'd be sat back selling petrol and hybrid cars forever and a day. So for me at least, it's an absolute requirement that the government kickstarts these things, and then hopefully in the fullness of time market forces will interact, and as Darren said in the example earlier about the charging competitiveness of chargers has brought the prices down, and that will of course is a market forces influence. So I hope that happens in the fullness of time, but for sure I think the government still needs to really help us along here to get things moving. That'll be my view anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And what's your thoughts on that, Darren?
Not too dissimilar. I think consumer and businesses alike won't opt in of their own free choice at the moment, because there's no real incentive, I don't believe, or enough to drive them down that route. So I think there's 2 key points here. I think in order to get to that mass adoption rate, it needs to be mandated by government and legislation form that is not just kicked down the road like the previous 2025 ruling. So it needs to be upheld. But that said, to get there, it requires commitment by law, I think, and incentives. So the key part of this is taxation. And how the revenue will get that return into the government coffers in order to spend it on. It won't be for infrastructure problems just relating to sort of heavy goods vehicle, alternate fuels, etc. They need taxation in all its forms to keep the UK PLC economy driving forward. So therefore, Sam alluded to earlier about sort of road user charging, a price per kilometre based charge. Now, I recall when I was at university, albeit I was a mature student, in 2009, I'd done a paper on it where on the back of a government white paper, he was looking to introduce or pilot in London lorry road user charging, and that was 15 years ago. We had the technology then. We've got better technology now. It's a fair charging based mechanism, which would get away from the RFLs, and that'd be rolled into one charging mechanism. We've got the technology to do it, and I think that there's also a fairness among operators that for those who are operating on a mileage based matrix, cost is then appropriate to your business model. So I think there's a lot of taxation focus that needs to be applied into how, one, they're going to be able to continue to generate the revenue streams into government, but secondly, what's fair and creates an appetite to adopt emerging technologies if they're not going to be mandated by legislation. So taxation and mandated legislation, I think, is key really to driving this forward at pace.
Yeah, and it's interesting, as a diesel driver, I may like turkey voting for Christmas, but maybe at that time, as they incentivize, the use of electric vehicles, they may be penalised and the use of traditional fuels, but by even higher taxations, they make it less cost prohibitive to do it, to drive change. That's a very good point. And Sam, you was very kindly telling us about the work you're doing with a number of companies. I think you mentioned Kuehne+Nagel and companies like that, where the government are sponsoring change, which is great. How does it work? How does that work for those individual companies? So if they had to get a vehicle, what would actually happen?
Yeah, so the principle is that there's a proportion of every pence in every pound that is spent on assets and elements that are required for the project. Innovate UK funded project is supported by government. So anywhere between 60 and 80 pence in the pound is being given to those companies in order to help with the transition over to an EV alternative to their current diesel trucks. So in some cases, people are buying vehicles outright and just getting a very healthy subsidy on those vehicles. And in other cases, it's the leasing company that is buying the asset and enjoying that discount, if you like, but then is leasing the vehicle to the end user, and therefore their leasing cost is dramatically reduced as a result, if not on parity with the diesel alternative. And that's a really good way of getting people to understand how it works and the mechanism of how it works, and also the justification for putting some of these trucks on the road. And just going back to the previous point and this one, there's examples across the world where we've seen in Norway is a very good example where tax incentives across all vehicles has been really, really effective, both in EHGVs and in the car world. In Germany, I know it's $80,000 per truck is the grant there, and $120,000 in California in the States. Ours are not as high as that. I think it's 25,000, I believe. So if it isn't for a project like mine, then the incentives over in the UK are far less than some of our friends overseas. So I think we need to look further afield and see what other people are doing and seeing what works, both from a tax incentive and a grant perspective in the longer term. Because my project's great, it's doing really successfully. We've got loads of vehicles on the road, but it's finite. There's only a certain amount of hauliers in that, and it will end. What happens after that? And one of the calls for not just my project but the other ones in the wider consortiums is what happens next, and that's what we're asking government at the moment. There's no point giving this little injection and then walking away and hoping market forces drive it, because it's not going to work. There has to be a tapered approach, and the grant claims that you can get for just outright purchase probably aren't enough at the moment to encourage the next cohort of people to take that step. So it does need to be, front and center, I think, of this government to understand how best to approach the next level of electrification of these harder to decarbonize vehicles.
Yeah, and you mentioned in other countries the amount of subsidy is higher. Has the adoption rate proportionately been a lot higher as well? Does it appear to be working?
I don't know the statistics on those vehicles. I know the grant values, but I don't know the registrations. But it would be a really interesting thing to look up, actually, to see what incentives have happened and what the result of those are. I mean, obviously we've seen in Norway, it's made a tremendous difference, and the vast majority of vehicles of all sizes and shapes are now electric. So it's obviously working in that sector. We need to look, and they're no doubt looking at us too, right, in terms of what we're doing and how it's working over here as well, with the type of incentives and Innovate UK funding, the DFT funding, etc., to see how we're working at it as well. So it's very, very nascent market, let's be honest, in particular in the heavy goods side, and we're all learning as we go.
If I could just,
and that probably. Sorry, go down.
Yeah, if I can just add to that point, David, in terms of incentives, businesses need stability and clarity in order to forecast, develop their strategies, whether it be short, medium terms. And with a lack of clarity around the incentives and grants, yes, they've got to be finite. There's no such thing as a free lunch forever. It's just a little bit of clarity and commitment and making sure that time-bound intervention, if you call it that, it is nice and clear. So when you are planning, and typically if you're not purchasing outright, you're looking at lease cycles of 4, 5, possibly 6 years on heavy goods vehicles. What you don't want to be happening to your budgets and your financial planning of the business is having shocks in years 4, 5, and 6 that wasn't factored in at the outset when you're doing your cost benefit analysis, in which way is going to drive your procurement decisions. So that clarity and having some sense of total understanding of what time-bound measures are put in place, or any relaxation or any grant incentives. It just needs to be upfront and clear to give us that commitment to financially plan business activities going forward, for particularly around leasing. We're operating sort of 2,000 vehicles, and getting a surprise in year 3 of a 5-year lease cycle, it doesn't help. Again, referring back to that single-digit margin, it's a huge impact to people's P&Ls. So that clarity, stability, and making sure whatever commitment is in there, we don't start driving forward again just to increase taxation on operators. We're taxed to the hill as it is in that commercial vehicle world, and it's just a lack of clarity sometimes which deter people to making that investment. Because you just don't know when that's going to be snaffled away from you.
Yeah, and the government funded project that Sam has very kindly alluded and told us about, that would be attractive to companies like DX as part of your transition, wouldn't it? I know there's only a definite amount, and everyone wants everything. It's human nature. We all like something that benefits us, but it helps in that transition. And maybe they could find a way that they do it for every, have a limited amount, but only so much for each company. So the bigger companies can't take advantage of the opportunities. It's a real challenge. And okay, and next thing I want to talk about is, as the green transition, and this is part of the green transition, continues. Can we allow market forces at all to do this, or has to be all driven by government? Because I have a view as a consumer that if I was getting a parcel or a pallet delivered, if there was 2 options, you had traditional delivery cost and a green cost that was maybe 10% more, I think I'd, often pay the 10% more, and feel good about myself. And obviously you have to hope and trust that whoever you're paying it for, it went to the right places. But do you think that is just too wishing the best of the world, or do we, to make these changes happen for costs, because the cost to serve for green transition is more? Do we need the government to drive that? So therefore the DXs and the DHLs and the parcel forces all having that part in their pricing, because if not, it looks like you're just putting your margin up, Darren, which obviously you're not. What are your thoughts on that, both of you?
So I think it's a really interesting point. You've only got to look at the Uber model, where I will often take the green option. It's not significantly more, but there's a little bit more to travel in the back of a Tesla. And I think when you try and transpose that across onto the commercial vehicles sector, when you're running HGV operations, trucks are like aeroplanes. We're only earning money when the wheels are turning. And again, when you're on a small margin business, you can't afford to have the operational redundancy in your fleet to have an option available that the wheels are not turning daily. So that in itself, I think, David, whilst at a consumer level, could work, I think on a commercial vehicle operation in the logistics industry, having operational redundancy of a green option that somebody may or may not select to choose from is going to drive costs even further into our business. So we wouldn't have that operational redundancy of any sort of vehicle stood in a yard just in case somebody would like to select a green option. Where we'd like to be is run on green options 100% and take that choice away. But I don't think it could work being focused on having a fleet that is necessarily a selection by another business to increase their ESG or green credentials, have that readily available as an operator to be selected, I think it drives too much operational redundancy and wouldn't be cost viable to us.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. And your thoughts on that, Sam?
My thoughts are that, and I used to say this a lot when I ran my own logistics company, what I would love to see is a world where you can no longer have such a thing as free delivery. What I would love to be able to see is that you have to add a charge you have to have a visible charge to every delivery, because there is no such thing as free delivery, right? Someone's paying for it. No. You're always paying for it. It's just hidden. And therefore, when it's hidden, you can't see how much that is contributing to the thing that you're purchasing. And if there was a greater, and this speaks not to the hauliers or the way they're pricing, but to the end consumer and perhaps the retailers, and say, if people could really see how much these things actually cost. And so if I want to buy an office chair and I want it tomorrow, I'll pay a premium for that. But if you're going to tell me it's a £2 rather than £10 because I get it in the next 5 days, I'm probably going to choose the latter option, because it's not an urgent requirement and I can have it when it arrives, sort of thing, and encourage behavioral pattern. I've always likened it to the plastic bag tax of old, when we all had to start paying money for our plastic bags, and we knew why. It was because of the environmental element, and lo and behold, everyone went out the supermarket with their holding their Mars bars and their sandwiches and not paying the extra 5p, as a proportion of the thing that was. It's almost an irrelevance, and yet we all did it because it made a behavioral pattern change, because we understood the reasoning why we were doing it, and there's something about our behavior that just made us not want to waste that extra 5p or 10p or 20p, whatever it is these days. And I'd love to see that same incentive brought into the logistics world, so that the end consumer, had a better understanding of how much these things really cost to get them delivered to their door so very conveniently. And maybe that might drive, and that doesn't even speak to the fuel type. It might be that it's a full diesel fleet. It's just that it would be a more efficient diesel fleet, which means Darren's margins would be better, and the end user would understand that there is a decision to make, rather than just assuming everything's free delivery and I'll get it tomorrow morning. I think it's a tragedy in my mind that we have hidden something that is so very important to all of us on a daily basis, and the consumer just assumes it's all free, and it isn't.
No, as you say earlier, nothing is free. And going back to the plastic bag scenario that you both mentioned separately, we've gone to the bags to life, and they are the norm now, aren't they? We've all got them in our bags, and sometimes we've got too many of them. But the fact you have a charge for them, you accept and you deal with, don't you? And I think it's just that has been a game changer, isn't it, in a static market, really, isn't it? Decision was made, and we all followed it through. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And it goes back on to how we, the government. And all this is connected to how the government changes from the traditional tax income they make from fuels through the VAT and general taxation. When they lose that, and that will be a big number. I don't know what the number is, but that'll be billions and billions. Is how they replace that over time. With a pay-as-you-go type model that's got to be more effective. And on a personal level, I think pay-as-you-go is probably the best option, because the more you use it, the more you pay for it, and and that affects roads and everything. How do we influence them to make sure they change things for the greater good, but they're also practical? Because you don't want them to change something thinking they understand it and they don't, and they may drive extra cost into the supply chain, and it actually becomes less greener, even though it may look greener on paper. How would do you think we should influence that, Darren?
So, a lot of these lobby groups already exist in multiple forms. You've got various environmental groups, but for me, I sit within the Log UK. I've been to Parliament with the Fleet Manifesto many years ago. The RHA does similar. So there are lobby groups pressing government constantly making them aware of the challenges we as operators face in terms of cost, but also seeking direction and clarity, I think is the key point. So I don't think it's the government's, it's a case of they're not hearing it or they've been advised. I think it's just that wrestling, the ball to the ground, so to speak, and just getting on with policy to drive this change forward. I mean, because consumers and business won't ultimately make that sacrifice, because businesses only exist, right, for shareholder value, to deliver shareholder value. That's why businesses exist. It's not to change the world. It's not to become environmental campaigners. We exist to make or generate value for shareholders. So people in business and consumers, like you've mentioned it already, David, won't change their mindset. It needs government investment and appetite and a pace of change. Unfortunately, where we are in 4 years, will this government be in play in 4 years' time? Who knows? So these long-term infrastructure, was only announced yesterday by the Chancellor. Some of these are 10, 15, 20 years on. And it only takes a different government with a different mindset. And it's either diluted or scrapped. So you never kind of do a full cycle in this major investment. HS2 a case in point. So it needs to be driven forward at a governmental level and at speed as well. Because if you're fluffing around the edges of it, you're not going to get the major change that I think everybody wants and demands these days in terms of that environmental contribution. So government really needs to play their part, strong leadership, tough decisions. Tough decisions normally result in taxation, unfortunately. But if we want to get to where we were in terms of zero emissions, it's a long journey, and it needs some people with teeth in there who are stand by and prepared to sacrifice themselves and get it out there. And that's the only way I think we're going to see meaningful mass adoption and expedited change of any policy at the moment. It needs that commitment, and I'm not quite seeing it at the moment. It's very diluted.
Yeah, and your thoughts, Sam?
Yeah, that's a tough act to follow, to be honest. Darren's, I think, articulated it very well. I was going to go down the same route about the sort of lobbying element. I think there's a lot of those institutions that Darren mentioned that is doing its level best, but how much of it is being listened to, I'm not so sure. It's sort of, it seems to be a bit of a divide sometimes for me, where the people within the church walls are perhaps the oil companies or the academia that are feeding the government with certain information, which I'd far rather hear Darren's view at the coalface, people who've been there and done it and understand how these things really tick, and get that sort of impact that goes into the government's understanding and learning. So, how much of this lobbying works, I don't know, but it would be lovely to sort of see a little bit more of that really manifesting itself in change within government. But as Darren said, as it has been for many years now, it's a revolving door, isn't it, of ministers and governments, and that's quite tough to make long-term decisions when you're not quite sure who's setting the rules. But it is what it is, and we just have to roll with it, right? There's not much we can do about those things, I suppose. We just got to keep pushing forward and making sure that we do what we can with the government, but also demonstrating in the commercial market forces that these things can be done as well. And I guess a collective effort will help open their eyes to the fact that this can work. And please do help us to accelerate it. But I don't really have a silver bullet for this either, right? There just isn't one, doesn't exist.
No, it'd be nice if the head of the Warehouse Association of Pallet Networks could all maybe lobby together, as one, almost agree a approach, because they've all got, slightly different perspectives from their worlds. And it's not a criticism, it's just, I've done podcasts with some of them, so I've seen them, and they're all, the greater good. And there's lots of issues, that the government should get involved in. It'd be nice if we could have a single organisation or group that lobbied on behalf of the industry, with head people, maybe, a couple of the CEOs of the GXOs and the big users, the biggest users, to represent them as well. It'd be good if we could do that, because if not, we got careful. We're talking, and we could possibly be here in 5 years and do the same thing again, and nothing's changed. So thanks so much for your time. So much for your time and effort going through this, and hopefully it'll be interesting to our viewers. They'll find it interesting, and hopefully between everyone's work, we can influence change over time. Thank you very much for your time again, Darren and Sam. Really appreciate it.